2014. Due to his pioneering work with the SAR team following a B-1 crash in 1991, Dr. Moore was the first captain selected as the Air Force Psychologist of the Year. His operational assignments included 2 years in Turkey, 3 years in Korea, 6 months in Afghanistan, and collectively over 13 years supporting the Bone and Herc missions at Dyess Air Force Base. In 1996, Psycho attended the ACSC in residence, then stayed on for 3 more years as a faculty member. Dr. Moore adjunct taught in the Leadership and Command course and developed a stage and seminar lesson on operational stress management, which he presented 8 consecutive years. Psycho continues to serve former servicemen and women as a medical psychologist in the West Texas VA. Please join me in welcoming Psycho back to the ACSC stage.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Bartlett, for that introduction, and Dr. Forsyth, Commandant, for your invitation here. I am excited to be back on the stage. I walked around a little bit, and it's like a time capsule. It's just, everything's just the same, just the people have changed. That's exciting. Okay, well, here's the disclaimer. We'll get that out of the way. It's just me up here talking. I'm not here representing the government in any way. Everything I say is my thoughts, and I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. Okay, so here's what I did when I was here for the 3 years as a faculty member. Some of the most interesting things that I did were kind of this last bullet. And I remember one particular day where I got a call from the Commandant. And he said, "Hey, Psycho," he said, "some of the faculty have come to me kind of in confidence, are a little concerned about Dr. Forsyth. I wonder if you could go by and do a welfare check on him." So I set up an appointment, I went by, and when I got to his office, this is what I found. And so some of you may be thinking that I photoshopped this. I did actually make up the part about the Commandant, but that's a real picture. And there's the hat he wore. And so we had a lot of fun when we were here. We did some great things together, and he was then a lieutenant colonel and the department chair for DEA, and now, of course, is the dean, and we're happy to have him. And you don't look that much older, sir. I like that.
He's just telling me I look really old.
It's all a matter of perspective, I guess.
All about my friends.
Okay. Well, this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about PTSD, and we're going to cover these topics. Now, before I tell you what I want to tell you, I want you to kind of quiz yourself and see what you know about PTSD and how it's treated. So here's the first question. You don't have to shout it out, and you don't get graded on this. But just in your own mind, take this test, and then I'll give you the answers later on in the session. So this is about medication. Which of these is the most effective? Next question. Which of these conditions is worsened by the presence of PTSD, comorbid, co-occurring? Which talk therapy protocol has evidence-based literature to support it? And finally, if a person is deployed and they're experiencing some kind of trauma, what is the most likely outcome for that individual? Okay, so I hope you did well, and I hope all of you knew the answers to all of those, but if you didn't, hopefully by the end of today, you will. All right, so let's talk about what is that. So if you go to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the book that we have that has all the diagnoses in it, there are specific things that have to be done. So the first one is you have to have some kind of a traumatic event. Something has to happen to you. And this isn't an unfortunate thing or, a sad thing. It's actually a traumatizing thing. So we've got to be talking here about death, near death, injury, those kinds of things. Either happening to you or happening to someone with you in your presence. So this is not about going to a movie and seeing something, but if you're in a foxhole and somebody next to you gets shot, that counts just as much as if you were shot or almost shot. And so you have to have the trauma, and that's the direct or indirect. Then there has to be some results of having gone through that traumatic experience. So people re-experience it. They have daymares, they have nightmares. It comes back to mind when you don't want to think about it. Avoidance. People excuse themselves from seeing things, hearing things, tasting things, touching things that remind them of the incident because it's unpleasant, right? Mood changes, okay? People can kind of be all over the map, and reactivity, the hair trigger, the hyper alertness, the hyperactivity, those kinds of things. So those are the hallmarks of PTSD. And then there has to be not just the presence of the symptom, but it's got to be not only a what, but a so what. There has to be something that happens that impacts your life, either at home or at work or both. And then it can't be due to something else, okay? It can't be due to a medication. When I was in Bagram, all of us were on mefloquine. And I remember 4 of the 6 people I was deployed with there in the medical group in the mental health clinic took themselves off mefloquine because they all said, I don't even know who I am on this med. I feel so weird. And they went back to doxy. And of course now there's been a lot of problems with that, and we don't give it out as a first run, but when I was there we did. So some people were experiencing symptoms, but it was more medical related, so you have to rule that out. Okay, so what causes it? Well, you start off with the trauma, and then inside of our brain, when something happens to us, good, bad, or indifferent, our brain is recording the facts. We remember what happened to us. We also have a limbic system, and we have feelings about what happened to us. And those two things get linked together by the brain to form a combined memory, such that in the future, when we're exposed to something related to the facts, we come to the same intersection where we had an accident, or we have the same kind of experience or the same feeling or smell the same thing or taste the same thing, then we get triggered. And so that's the hallmark characteristic of this, and that is normal. That's your brain working properly. You're supposed to remember this stuff. You're supposed to learn from it. And the emotional piece of it there is to amplify the learning. But here's the trick. Your brain is also designed to keep the facts and jettison the feelings. So the natural process of things is that in the moment you have all the facts, all the feelings, but then over time the feelings subside. When that doesn't happen, and you keep having the same intensity level of emotional response that you had originally, that's what we call abnormal, because that shouldn't happen. That's not the way your brain is designed. And if it happens that way, that's a misfire, and that's what we fix when we do treatment for PTSD. So, when something bad happens to you or someone you know, what is the number one go-to strategy for dealing with that? It is avoidance. I don't want to think about it. I distract myself. I do something else. I think something else. I feel something else. And that is a great choice. There is nothing better than avoidance for a historical event that you can't change. Can't ever do it over, right? You don't get a do-over on history. So something happens, good, bad, or indifferent. The best thing you can do about it is ride it out. Because within 30 days, the vast majority of any feelings you have about that will simply go away on their own. So avoidance is a great strategy, except when it isn't. And so when we see a person have a trauma, over time, the natural course of things is the intensity level of the emotions, whoops, I'm doing something wrong. The intensity level of that emotion subsides. Unfortunately, there are some memories that get stuck on stupid up here. They don't decline naturally. Those are the ones that you need something different about as opposed to just showing up. So, let's think about this. Whatever has happened to you that's been traumatizing, regardless of the source, how many of these things did you actually have to do something about? Even people I treat with PTSD will freely admit that the vast majority of things that happened to them just simply went away. They're in my office because of what didn't go away. And sometimes there's only one story that didn't go away. That happened last Thursday. I treated a guy from Desert Storm who 20 years ago had one story that hadn't bothered him for a really long time. And then in the very recent past, he got triggered by a different story, and it brought this other story back to him, and he couldn't get it out of his head. He was in my office because of that one story. All that time had been delayed. And so that's kind of the way that this works sometimes. So, when people come to my office and they have PTSD, as this individual did, What I tell people is, look, you're already 95% or so successful at dispatching old traumatic memories when you walk through the door. My job is to take care of the 1 to 5% of what's left over. So people think of PTSD as this huge problem, and it does become a huge problem functionally, but practically we're talking about a small percentage of all the things that ever happened to somebody. And so you have to keep it in perspective in that way. So I do a lot of work with chronic pain. I was treating chronic pain long before I was really treating PTSD seriously and in great quantity. So I'm going to draw a parallel for you of a pain response and then talk about a psychological response we call PTSD, and that's because it's a psychophysiological disorder, so a mind-body problem. That's what I spend my day doing. People come to me because they have physical problems, sleep, pain, those kinds of things, or they have PTSD, or they have both. So a person has some kind of a pain experience, and when we have pain in our bodies, we go to modern medicine. And the tools of modern medicine are 3: cutting, prescribing, and manipulating. That's what you do when you do medicine. I don't do any of those. I go to jail if I do any of those because I'm not credentialed. I talk to people. But that's what medicine does. When medicine doesn't work for you, when a cutting, prescribing, or manipulating doesn't fix it, then you start having problems. One of the things that gets messed up is people sleep. And then they start losing control of their lives because they can't do the things they wanted to do because they hurt and they can't get a good night's sleep. And so they turn to other things for pleasure. They try to overcompensate in other areas of things that they still can control, and then they do too much of it. And then they withdraw because they circle the wagons, because avoidance is what you do if you have chronic pain, right? You go to your doctor and you say, "Doctor, it hurts when I move my leg that way." What do they say to you? "Don't move your leg that way," right? And so that's not helpful. So, but to the extent we can, we avoid, because remember, that's the hallmark. The problem is your life gets smaller and smaller, suffering increases, and then that pain-suffering cycle gets started in earnest. So when we think about this, what's the difference between people who have acute pain and chronic pain? Medicine does really well with most acute pain. We suck at most chronic pain, unfortunately. So this is what happens. Both experience the discomfort, they're inconvenienced, they use avoidance. But then when the acute pain doesn't go away like it's supposed to, then people are having problems, and it's more than just the pain at that point. It's the loss of control, it's the other sequelae that roll in. So in like fashion, if I may draw the parallel, if you have a psychological trauma, what happens? You avoid. Why would you not do that? It's the best arrow in the quiver. It's absolutely the best strategy. But then when the stuff doesn't go away on its own, what happens? That means your brain's still working on it. So you get the daymares, the nightmares, and then you use medication, some prescribed, some not. But you do what you have to do to try to take the edge off of that. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't work, then you overcompensate on other things. You develop other compensatory strategies. You spend money. You do exciting sports, high adrenaline things, anything to distract yourself. Because remember, avoidance is what it's all about. People withdraw, okay? And the sad end of that story for some of the Vietnam vets was to find themselves out in a remote piece of land in Idaho, living in a cardboard plywood shack with their property surrounded by claymores and signs that said, "Do not trespass." Because if people come around, people are unpredictable, and you get triggered, and when you get triggered, then you're out of control. So you circle the wagons. All my PTSD patients, what time of day is it when they go to Walmart to shop? 2 to 4 in the morning. Why? Because there's very few people there. As they go through Walmart, it's a big place. They're having to check 6. If you have fewer people there, it's easier to shop, isn't it? So people have to change their lives. I've had people come to me in tears because they wanted to go to the 4th of July celebration with their family. And so they went, and the fireworks started going off, and they had to leave and go sit in the car in the parking lot. Now, intellectually, did they all know these are just fireworks? Of course they did. It didn't matter. They were having that leftover emotional response, and it pissed them off, and rightly so. And so it has a huge impact on people's lives and can be very debilitating, even more so than chronic pain in my experience. And then we have the loss of control and, of course, the suffering. So, to draw the exact parallel, look at what happens. The exact same thing is happening. That's why they're both called psychophysiological disorders. And that's why they're both fixed exactly the same way. So, when we get to this, we want to try to manage acute stress as best we can. We're all good at that. You wouldn't be in this auditorium today if you couldn't manage acute stress. But what happens when you're trying to manage chronic stress? If you use the same strategy for one as you did for the other, you will fail. And you will fail catastrophically. And the people that come to my office and have a PTSD diagnosis are failing, not because they're failing people or because really bad things happen to them, but because they're using the wrong strategy. So let's take a simple example. Let's suppose that you have a party at your house and you want to invite some folks over, so they come, and people are having a good time. They're playing cards, they're listening to music, a couple of guys are on the Xbox. People are having a good time, and as the party progresses, as the night wears on, people start attriting, right? They go home, they go and do other things. Finally, it's you and this one guy who's hunched over the Xbox, playing, and just oblivious to the fact that everybody else is kind of gone. So you kind of say, dude, how you doing? I'm doing great, man. And so he doesn't get it, so you go around, you kind of clean up. Finally, you get everything done. And now you're ready to go to bed. And so it's like you have a choice. You can either kind of prompt the guy again, or you can just go to bed and have to listen to the Xbox all night. So you decide, I don't want to listen to this. So you reach down, you get the remote, you flip off the TV, and what happens? He snaps out of his revelry, and you say, I am so glad that you came, and you escort him to the door and send him out, right? So you move from a passive, please get a clue strategy, and when that fails, what do? You shift to an active strategy where you intervene. And so you can see how, if we're talking about PTSD instead of house guests, people are agreeable to change to a different strategy if they just knew what one was. And if they don't know, then they can't do it, right? You can't do something you haven't been trained to do. So, when avoidance fails, you need a different strategy. The problem is, it's a secret. We don't share it with people. And so I'm here today to kind of pull back the curtain and do that. So when you think about sustaining PTSD, why do we have it? You can go back in history. You can go to the Old Testament. You can go to antiquity writers. You can find perfect descriptions of soldiers on the battlefield having classic PTSD symptoms. It's part of the human experience. You can get animals to have PTSD. I had a dog that was handed down to us, and it was a stray dog that had come out of a shelter, and the dog had PTSD to the day it died. I failed in treating my dog. I do better with people. But the dog was just very skittish, and you could tell. So even dogs get that if you're punished, you run away, right? But if you're on a leash, you can't go far. And so it's all organisms. It's not just people. After Vietnam, the VA, where I work now, said, these people, they had it really bad in the jungle. We need to give them treatment. We're psychologists, we're into talking about stuff, right? So we're going to hire all these therapists. We're going to bring these people in. We're going to get them to talk about their trauma. And if they talk about it and they're open about it and they don't repress it, they're going to get better. So we brought them in, and what happened? Well, for 30 years, they came every week to group, and they didn't get better. Why is that? We're scratching our heads over that. What's going on with this? They're doing everything they're supposed to do. Why are they not getting better? Well, as it turns out, we were treating the wrong thing. And in my professional lifetime, I was in graduate school in the mid-'80s. I remember treating people with PTSD and not really knowing what I was doing. Went to my supervisor and said, what am I supposed to be doing? I don't know either. We really didn't know. In the last 30 years, we have finally figured this out. And I'm pleased to stand up here on the stage today and tell you we've cracked the code on PTSD. We have an effective, rapid treatment for that. Nobody should be walking around with that for long. So what happens when you treat PTSD? Well, you break that link between the facts and the feelings. And then the end of that is that you remember the facts clearly and the feelings less so. That's the natural end state of what your brain does anyway. And if you get something stuck, that's what we do in treatment. So, here's what we know now. PTSD is all about, and only all about, unfinished emotional business. There is a low to poor correlation between how many times you were traumatized, how intense the trauma was, what you were doing when it happened. I have lots of patients with one story. And then I have other patients with a dozen stories. But even the ones with a dozen, we're still at the 95 or so % point of most of the stuff went away before they ever darkened my door. So we're talking here about a relatively small number of things, but a very important number. So here's what you have to remember. PTSD is not about you. If you got strep throat and you went to your doctor and they did a rapid strep test and they said, yep, you're positive for strep, would their next question be, and who gave it to you? What were you doing when it happened? How come you had it and the person next to you didn't get it? No, that would be stupid, wouldn't it? Now, a public health officer might be interested in that, but a physician is not. A physician's going to get out their book, they're going to write you a script, you're going to take the antibiotic, and when your streptococci level drop, then you're not going to have strep throat anymore. That's the same model we use with PTSD. It doesn't matter why you have it. It doesn't matter who has it. It doesn't matter when you got it, why you got it, why you still have it. All that is irrelevant. That is chaff and flares. That is independent of people getting better. So, most people, anybody know the statistics? Less than 10% of people are exposed to any given trauma go on to get PTSD. So we're talking about a relatively minority number of people that get it, and then they don't have to keep it. So, how about this? When people are traumatized, when they're going through a trauma experience, there is no difference in that moment between the person who goes on to get PTSD and the one who does not. When you're in deep kimchi, you're all the same. The difference is 30 days later, if you have 100% of your unfinished emotional business finished, you do not have PTSD. You don't get it, you don't have the symptoms. Just like if you had all your pain resolved, you wouldn't become a chronic pain patient. If you have some things wrong with you, either pain or emotional things, that's when you go on to manifest the disorder. So, I want to talk with you now about stories. And I swear I am not making any of this up. These are real stories from my practice, and I want to tell you what happened, because to me, it's beyond exciting. Excuse me, let me grab a drink. It gets dry and windy up here when I talk. I don't know why that happens. Okay, so 2008, I'm at Bagram. I'm the senior psychologist, and we have a Chinook with a sling load going through a valley, low and slow, crashes. Because they were low, because they were slow. Nobody really injured in that crash. Got 5 crewmen. They were all men in that particular crew. So they crash. Within a couple of minutes, they're on the radio. They call for rescue. Rescue comes in. They set up a perimeter. No one is hurt. There was a rather bewildered Afghan farmer who came up to the helicopter and wondered why it was on top of his barn. But they managed to shoo him off and without an incident. And then they were rescued, and then they come back to the medical group, and then, of course, they go through the protocol, right? The flight surgeon draws blood, talks to them. The senior psychologist comes in, debriefs them. So they go on about their business, go back and go to bed. So a few days later, maybe a week and a half later, I get a call from the chief warrant over at the Chinook Squadron. He says, hey, Doc. He said, you're the senior psych, right? I said, yes, Chief, I am. He said, well, one of my guys in that Chinook, he said, he's not doing real well. He's kind of having some reluctance to fly again, having some difficulties. Can you do anything for him? Are you the right guy to call, and can you do anything for him? I said, Chief, you have no idea. I said, I am the guy, and I was there. I knew his story before you did. I was there. I've met all your crewmen. Absolutely, I'll see this guy. And we set up a time to send him in. And then there was a pause. And I thought, uh-oh, there's more to this story. Sure enough, wait for it. Sure enough, Chief said, well, there is one other thing, Doc. I said, what would that be, Chief? He said, well, my guy is kind of set to rotate back to the States for some R&R. I said, when would that be happening, Chief? He said, 2 days. I said, not a problem. He will absolutely be on that plane, and he will come back to you fixed. He came in, I talked with him, gave him some information, had him do the habituation protocol. Probably by the time he touched down in CONUS, he was fixed. I don't know exactly when he got fixed because I didn't see him again, but I do know that he did come back and he went right back to work. And that's kind of the way it goes. That's what should be happening. If you were just traumatized and you jump on it right now, if I could get into the emergency room and see people right after they came in out of a tick, they didn't go on to develop PTSD. In fact, they habituated what happened to them faster than if they just let it go its natural course. And so, it makes sense, doesn't it, that if you have 5 people on a helicopter, and you remember I told you the incidence is about 10%, about 1 out of 5 might go on to get PTSD symptoms. But here's the thing. I could understand if the guy that came into me had been the loadmaster in the back, because his experience of a helicopter crash is very different than the people who are up in front, right? Some people are flying, some people are just riding. So it would make sense to me that there's a difference between being in the back of a Chinook and being in the front of the Chinook. But the guy that came in was the co-pilot. Now, I would argue that sitting 3 feet from the pilot and doing the same things to try to keep the plane in the air as long as possible and without crashing, that's about as close to the same experience as you can do. But yet, the pilot was not having problems, and the co-pilot was. And the other 3 crewmen did not have problems. So this is my point. It's not about you. It's about fluke circumstance. It's how it struck you in the moment. It says nothing about you that it continued to bother you any more than it says anything about you about why you got strep throat and somebody else didn't. Okay, where are my Viper drivers in here? Got any Viper guys, gals, folks? Okay. I was at Kunsan for 3 years and got to hear the Vipers all the time. It was wonderful. Well, I was there during my second tour. It was towards the end of my second tour. And we had a very experienced Viper driver who, during one of the exercises, and they go up, full of fuel, full of bombs, full of bullets, plus a flight lunch, and he's up there flying, hit some bad weather, declared an in-flight emergency, and put the plane down in an emergency landing on the tarmac. Now, for those of you that fly F-16s, is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's a very bad thing, to put a jet down heavy in a combat landing. Didn't jettison anything, didn't have time to do anything, boom, on the ground. He wasn't exactly sure why he did that. He just knew that he was panicking and had to get that plane and get out. So they sent him to Japan, they sent him all over the place for the $1 million workup. Nobody could find anything wrong with him. Flight surgeon comes to me and he says, Psycho, he said, we've done like every test we know on this guy, and we can't find anything wrong with him. Can you help him? And I said, well, I don't know, but it sounds like if I can't, that's a problem. So I absolutely send him in. So he came in. Now, let me just say that I get the fact that the last place a pilot would want to be is my office. In fact, I suspect if I gave most of you the choice of going back to the resistance phase at Fairchild or coming to see me for an appointment, it would be unanimous. I'm in. Take me back to the camp, right? I mean, it's not the place you want to go. So in my mind, I'm imagining what it must be like for a 15-year lieutenant colonel whose next assignment is squadron command to have gone through what he went through and then to take the 400-meter walk from his dorm to my office and to come in and to fill out the paperwork and to come in my office. So I felt really bad for the guy. I mean, that's got to be just dreadful. And to know, as he's walking there, that his entire career now hangs in the balance, and the only guy who has a chance of helping him is named Psycho. I mean, that's just awful. And so he came in, so I tried to be as accommodating to him as I could, and I asked him, I said, is there anything in your past that you can think of that was traumatizing for you that might have been related to this? He said, I've been thinking about this since it happened. I can't think of anything. And so we talked a little more, and I said, well, let's meet again. So we arranged to meet again in about a week. So he comes back, and he comes in, and we talk a little bit, and he said, it's funny. He said, after we talked, I went home and I kind of thought about it some more, and I remembered there was an incident when I was in UPT. And I didn't think anything about it before now, and I really didn't think much about it at the time, but there was an incident where we were flying around, we got in some cloud cover, and I lost SA for just a few seconds. But I remember panicking. Said my IP didn't even know about it. I recovered the aircraft fine, I got through it. And so I kind of forgotten about it because it didn't turn into anything. There was no paperwork, I didn't ask for help, it didn't affect the mission. But I remember I had that feeling, and that feeling was the same feeling I had the other day when I went through those clouds. And so I said, I think there's gold in them there hills. And so I taught him the protocol of how to habituate that. He came back again, he was symptom-free. I went to the vice wing commander and I said, your guy's ready to fly again. And I said, I would not say that to you if I wasn't willing to go up with him. So he's cleared hot, return him to duty. They did. Now, to fast forward the story, I know I was successful in that case, and here's why. Because about a week or so after that, I was at a wing stand-up meeting, and the Viper squadron commander came, and I got to know him, and he came over to me and he said, hey, Psycho, can I talk to you for a minute? So after the meeting, we went out. He said, listen, I really appreciate what you did for Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so. He said, that was awesome, and we're so happy to have him back. And he said, I want you to know that you can come to our hooch and drink with us anytime. Now, that would be the behavioral indicator of success. And now I'm down for most things, and I'm willing to do almost anything once. But even I couldn't get my head around the idea of the ADAP program manager going to an F-16 hooch and drinking with other guys. Just couldn't go there. It just was too weird even for me. And so I thanked him politely and said, I'll try to do that, knowing that I never would, and I think he knew I wouldn't either. But I really did appreciate the sentiment. And the reality is that he did go back to work, and he did move on with his career, and that's what should have happened. But I want to make the point that just because it's gone doesn't mean it's forgotten. Stuff gets stored up here, emotions, facts, and sometimes you have to be prompted to remember it. Sometimes it comes back on its own. Okay, bone folks. Bone men, bone women? Nobody's volunteering? You got nobody? Okay, well, I worked with the bone for a long time. I had a sitting squadron commander do the same thing. Hey, Psycho, can I talk to you for a minute after a meeting? So I went over and he said, I signed up to be a warfighter. I like flying the bone. I like doing what I do. I'm used to flying at altitude, looking through my sniper pod, pickling people. Don't have a problem with any of that. The Air Force, in its infinite wisdom, decided that what I needed to be doing instead of that was to be in a Humvee on the ground in Afghanistan doing hearts and minds missions. So he had done a tour in the stand, and he'd been out in the villages, and he'd taken fire, and stuff had happened. And he had seen things that he was not really prepared to see, both about how the people lived, independent of combat things, and then there were combat things too. And he said, I know I should be managing this okay, I should be adaptable, but he said, I'm not. I'm just not dealing with this very well. It's impacting my family, it's impacting my job, and, is there anything we can do about this? I said, absolutely. So he came in, gave me some education, worked with him for a couple of sessions, good to go. Solved, done. The expectations that we have sometimes are the thing that set us up to not be able to solve the problem. And so here was a guy that, good for him, felt comfortable enough with me to come in and be seen on the record. And I'd coordinate with the flight surgeons and all that. And he went back to work, and he's now retired, and occasionally I run into him at the VA and whatnot, and he's doing fine. Okay, let's talk about another sitting squadron commander. Lieutenant Colonel Squadron Commander, worked in my medical group, not in my chain of command. But she came to me one day and said, "Hey, Psycho, can I talk to you? You getting the pattern here?" People don't come to my clinic. They grab me, in the hall. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure." So she said, "Look, a few years ago, my niece, 21-year-old niece, was abducted by a couple of guys and murdered. And I was the family member, through a variety of circumstances, who was designated to deal with that. So she came, went down to the police, identified the body, took possession of the car with the blood stains on the floor of the vehicle and the trunk, sat through the entire trial, relived all of the traumatic testimony of everything that happened. And she got to the end of that and she said, that was hard, it was difficult, but I got through it. And I thought that that was resolved for me. And as best I could tell, it was resolved for me until I deployed to Bagram. So she had showed up at Bagram a couple of years after I did, worked in exactly the same place. And she said, when I was at Bagram, suddenly, when I saw some of those wounded people, when I saw some of that blood, she said, I went back. I realized that stuff wasn't resolved. And she said it was really hard for me. And I didn't say anything to anybody because I was afraid of my career and just concerned. And so, I just kind of struggled through it. And now here I am. And I'm a squadron commander. I'm working crazy hours and I'm burning the candle at both ends. And I've got a daughter and I'm not pulling it all together. And she wasn't comfortable coming to my clinic to get treatment. I said, not a problem. So I went to her office and just a couple of times we talked. And I gave her the information, explained to her a protocol that she could use on her own to process through some of this stuff. And she did that. And so I would check in with her, every few weeks. And so I think like the third or fourth time that I talked with her in this way, she said, I want you to know this is really working for me. She said, I can tell there's a difference. I feel more resolved about my niece. I feel like the combat stuff that I saw has kind of been put to bed. And then she stopped, and she broke eye contact and stared at the floor. And she began to cry as she told me the story of her being date raped. And she got through the story, with tears running down her face, still staring at the floor. And she shook her head and she said, I don't know why I told you that story. And I said, well, that's interesting, because I know exactly why you told me that story. And she looked up and she stared at me and she blinked. And I said, the reason you told me that story was because for the first time in your life, you could. And she blinked, and she wiped her tears, and she smiled, and she said, I believe you're right. And that, folks, was the moment, the exact moment where she got her life back. And I was privileged to have had a small role in that. This is what happens with PTSD, folks. Traumas can be layered, just like the strata. It's not always the presenting problem that is the real problem. And she did not even have insight into that. It wasn't like she was being cagey and didn't tell me that deliberately, she admitted later she had no idea that those things were connected in any way. But they obviously were. And once she cleared away the fog of the obvious things, the niece's murder, the combat experience, then she was able to get down to things that she had buried so deep that she was even unaware of it. But it didn't change the fact that those coals were still glowing even if they were buried under a foot of ash. And so it's important to understand this about PTSD. It's nefarious. It's tricky. It's insidious. It will eat you up if you don't deal with it. Nobody should be carrying PTSD around. It's okay to be traumatized. It's okay to get PTSD. That's an occupational hazard. Civilians have this happen to them from motor vehicle accidents. It's not just in combat. It happens at a higher rate among military people than it does among civilians, but not that much of a higher rate than it does among civilian first responders. So, we all signed up to be in an organization where we go to work, kill people, blow things up, set things on fire. So you can expect to be traumatized. And I'll just say, I can say this with 100% certainty, 100% of you will either yourselves be traumatized and go on to have an acute stress reaction or PTSD, or you will know someone who does it, or someday you will lead someone who does it. And so you need to get this, because it's not about you. It's about you being a leader and a commander. And when your people have this happen to them, you need to be able to pick up the phone and call the equivalent of psycho on your base and say, I need your help with Airman Snuffy, or whatever. Which leads me to my next story. Tech Sergeant, Intel guy, deploys to Afghanistan, and he's there, and the Intel folks would be the recipient of gifts from the field. So the operators would go out, they'd attack some people, the operators would gather up all the stuff that they collected, tapes, ammo, notebooks, things like that. Then the Intel folks would analyze that stuff. So it's supposed to have been gone through, it's supposed to have been processed. So this tech sergeant tells me the story of he's there at work one day, and he's an Air Force Intel guy, he's got two privates from the Army, they're detailed to him, that are working there. And this one private opens a crate, and in the crate there's sawdust, so they move away the sawdust. And so the private picks up a Chinese hand grenade by the pin and extracts it from the box because it's supposed to have been neutered. He, being a tech sergeant more experienced, looked at that and said, stop, do not move. He walked over, he grabbed the grenade, he grabbed the pin, he said, remove your finger. She removed it. He told them, get out of the building now and go call EOD. And then he very carefully placed the grenade back in there and waited for EOD to arrive. Turns out both of those Chinese grenades were live. Somebody had missed something somewhere and they'd not been taken care of, and so those were live grenades. That spooked him. There were a couple other things that spooked him. So he gets through his tour. He comes back home. He does his 2 weeks of R&R. He's a little squirrely, but everybody's a little squirrely in the first 2 weeks, so he doesn't think that much about it. But then it continues. And he then develops a pattern where he goes to work and he does his job, because work is always, almost 100%, always the last thing to go. So if you as a commander are looking at somebody's work performance and saying, oh, they're good to go. No, wrong. That's the last thing that'll go. And so he described to me that what had happened was he would come home at night, he would get his laptop, he would go into the laundry room of his base house, he would take his meal into the laundry room with him, he would shut the door and sequester himself in there all night. Work on his laptop, eat, and then go to bed and get up and do it all over again. Cut himself off from his family, cut himself off from his children, all of that. Well, the result of that behavior was that in a fairly rapid period of time, he gained 25 pounds. And he wasn't working out. And so guess how he ended up in my office? That's right. Phone call from his commander saying, hey, I got a guy. And he told me what he knew about the story. The guy came in. He's in fear for his life because literally, you all know what the climate is on PT tests and all that kind of stuff. Literally, he was going to lose everything. And he didn't know how to fix it, and he was terrified. In very short order, I explained to him what he needed to do. He did it. Within just a couple of weeks, most of his symptoms had subsided. The unit worked with him. They assigned a trainer to him, got him back on track. He got past the failed PT test, made steady progress, and actually made E7. Now that, folks, is how it's supposed to work. The reason that that happened, not the reason that he did what he did, but the reason that he ended up in my office was because I had been going to wing stand-ups and commanders meetings and pounding the table and saying, look, PTSD is the easiest disorder I treat in the entire diagnostic and statistical manual. If your people have PTSD, for heaven's sake, send them in. And that commander had heard that, and he remembered that, and he sent his guy in. And he got the treatment, and he returned to duty, and a solid asset was retained for the Air Force. Now, lest you all think I'm up here bloviating and trying to communicate to you that I'm Sierra Hotel about therapy and all that kind of stuff, let's talk about one that isn't so great. I was commissioned as an Air Force officer in January of 1982 in the reserves, and then I came on active duty. So I'm really old. And my dad was a World War II bombardier, so I grew up in the military until I was 11. So a lot of my life has been spent in the military. Out of all that time, do you know the total number of female snipers I have met? One. And I met that person in my office in Abilene, Texas. Now, this woman had a trauma history that could paper your wall. Prior to service trauma from family craziness, all kinds of stuff that we don't have time to get into. But suffice it to say that she maxed the scale of PTSD symptoms. She had had multiple treatments before, was very discouraged about it, and on top of that, she had a lot of physical problems. She was actually sent to me for the physical problems. I found out she had PTSD. So I talked with her and I said, hey, why don't you watch my presentation and see what you think, and if you want to do the treatment, I'll be happy to work with you. She watched it, she came back, she said, I think I want to do the treatment. She did the treatment, and at the end of that first session, I was shaking her hand, and her significant other was with her, and I shook her hand, and she smiled and said, you know, that went well. That was better than I thought it was. And her significant other was flabbergasted and said, she doesn't do that. What they were referring to was the smile. And so I knew that woman was going to get better. I knew it. I knew it was going to take a while, but I knew she was going to get better. So I followed with her. I never saw her again. Still haven't seen her again. It's a year and a half later. But I followed with her telephonically, and I'm watching the psychiatrist's notes. She lives in another city. I'm watching the psychiatrist's notes. She's continuing her care. I call her periodically and say, how are you doing? She said, I'm still doing the homework. I'm making progress, but I still got work to do. Now, we give people a scale of symptoms called the PCL-5, Post-Traumatic Checklist, version 5. It's 20 items. The scale is from 0 to 4, 5-point Likert scale, and you indicate how many symptoms you have. 0 would be none, 80 would be the most. When she was in my office, anybody want to guess her score? 80. Now I'm thinking, this woman's making progress. So a year after treatment, I call her, and I'm talking to her, I'm saying, how are things going? She said, well, I'm making progress, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. And I said, so I'm not going to ask you to formally do this, but you're familiar with the scale. If you were going to fill that scale out again for me today, what do you think your score would be? She said, about a 75. Oh, that was not the number I was hoping to hear. I was looking for like a 40, you know. something where there's been a significant decline. She hadn't made that much progress. So I thought, that's okay. She's making progress. And then she went on to tell me that she and the psychiatrist had been talking, and she has decided to sign up for a 3-month inpatient PTSD program in another state, and they were doing the paperwork to send her there. Now, she would have never considered doing that in the past. And the other consolation I give myself is she hasn't made a lot of progress, but I'm the first guy to move the needle. And there is no doubt in my mind this woman will get better. So we'll just wait and see. I don't know how long it takes, but that's the point, is people are on their own schedule, and it doesn't matter if they get better overnight, and I saw that happen. People that I saw in Afghanistan, they came in, by the next day they were done. Other people that had trauma that lasted a long time, they were not done, but they eventually got done. And so the longer you wait, time is not on your side. It's not a good thing. Okay, so back to the quiz questions. Let's see how you did. None of these are the most effective. Medications are not, repeat, not the most effective treatment. What are most people at the VA getting? Medications. We got a lot of work to do, folks. And so I'm just telling you that in the new clinical practice guidelines that are coming out, my understanding is medications are actually being moved to a second-line treatment, where they should be based on the literature. How about this? All the above. I meant to underline, I messed up. Yeah, it's all the above. Anything that will happen to your body, for most patients I treat, their brain is attached to the rest of their body. And so if one thing gets messed up, it messes up the other. And so all of these things are made worse. How about this? Yeah, there's actually literature to support all of this. Talk therapy is the treatment of choice. Has the highest effect size, happens in the least amount of time, and it is curative. Medications are palliative. They treat symptoms. You don't get better with your PTSD by taking meds. You feel better. If you want to get better, get some good talk therapy that's evidence-based. And it can happen very quickly. How about this? I hope that's what you thought. I hope you leave here today knowing that's true. Most people return to duty. Remember, only 10% of people who are exposed to any given trauma go on to get PTSD. So by definition, the most likely outcome is you return to duty. And most people completely resolve. Those that don't, that happens very quickly. So don't wait, come in and send your folks in. Now, there might be some time for Q&A at the end, probably not much, and that was kind of deliberate on my part, because the questions that you may have in your head about PTSD, you may not be able to stand up and ask in this auditorium. So I have a plan, because I'm a veteran of this auditorium. So on my website, which I'm sorry we were unable to get whitelisted in time before this, so that's why you're just now hearing about it, but it's available. You can hit it from your home thing, and maybe it'll come up here eventually. They're working that. On my website, there's an informational presentation. That's what I give to my patients to watch before they come in. That's what I want them to know about PTSD. I want them to decide if they have that, if they want to do the treatment. And so you can watch that as well, and you're welcome to give that link out to anybody, people that work for you, friends you have, whatever. There's also on my website a TED Talk, which is excellent. A VA psychologist gives this presentation. It's an excellent TED Talk, and I highly recommend it, about why we treat military people and how that's a little different than treating civilians. I recommend both of those. And then there's also a Contact Me page on my website. You are welcome to fill that out and write me. Now, I cannot do psychotherapy by email. I cannot give out medical advice by email. Well, if you have questions about how does PTSD work, you want to talk about the presentation, you have comments, recommendations, flames, whatever you got, you are welcome to write me under an anonymous email, and I will be happy to respond to you because I want you to have the information. Okay, so I'm going to close with these slides. Newton was a smart guy, and he lived in a world where things happened but no one could really explain why. And so he analyzed that, he spent time thinking about it, and he ended up with Newton's laws. He made mathematical order out of the things that he saw, and those laws persist to today. Einstein had different instrumentation, and he looked at other phenomena that Newton wasn't even aware existed, and he figured out there's a way to simplify that, and it looks like this. And so, geniuses like these guys, they figure things out, okay? But we can learn from geniuses, and I've tried to learn from a genius, and here's the thing that I want you to walk away with. And I hope that I have succeeded in explaining to you simply a complex problem, because it is not a complicated problem to fix. It is difficult to understand, but it is very simple to fix, because we know what causes it, and we can fix that. So, we have just a couple of minutes left, I think, and you're cleared hot to do what I think they have something at the end here for me, right?
Dr. Moore, on behalf of ACSD Class 76, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come out and speak to us today, and I'd like to present you with a class coin for appreciation of that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, class, you're dismissed. Back to your seminar.